Welcome everyone to another edition to As Above, So Below Radio. I'm your host, Martin Hodgson, and it gives me great pleasure to have you tuning in today. When you get a chance, please visit the website, holisticadvocate.com, and sign up for our free newsletter. Also, take a moment to subscribe and become a member. You'll not only gain access to our commercial-free, subscriber-based interviews, but also treat yourself to an assortment of fascinating people worth listening to. Today's guest is Gwen Olsen. After having worked 15 years as a sales rep in the pharmaceutical industry and working for companies such as Johnson & Johnson, Syntex Labs, Bristol-Myers Squibb, Abbott Laboratories, and Forest Laboratories, Gwen now candidly shares her experiences and insights on the dangers associated with Big Pharma and states that everyone is at risk for a prescription drug tragedy. Has Big Pharma gone too far, and are doctors complicit in their role in all of this? Can we reclaim our sovereignty to our health and rely more on holistic alternatives? Join me in welcoming Gwen as she discusses the prescription drug industry. Okay, first of all, Gwen, I want to give you a warm welcome for being on As Above, So Below Radio. I know we've been emailing each other back and forth, so I really appreciate your patience in finally having you on the show. And I also want to stress that the scope of this broadcast is for us to discuss your experiences as a pharmaceutical sales rep, and not to dissuade anyone who may be listening here who has been diagnosed or is diagnosed with depression or any other ailment. So folks, take note that, if anyone you know has been diagnosed with this condition, I'm sure that there are other holistic alternatives out there to pursue if you search for them, as the scripture states, ask and you shall receive here. If you don't resonate or trust your doctor, by all means, listen to your gut feelings and get a second opinion. Find someone else. Remember, you and you alone are in charge of your health. So, having stated that, Gwen, I want to just quickly ask you here, in the beginning of the interview here, can you just give a brief background about yourself and, what motivated you to write your book, which is called, by the way, Confessions of an RX Drug Pusher, which, by the way, is affectionately dedicated to your niece, Meg.
Yes, that's correct. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Martin. I very much appreciate this opportunity to share my experience with your audience. And to give you a little background information about myself, I went into the pharmaceutical industry in 1985. And stayed for a tenure of 15 years, over which that period of time I worked for 5 major manufacturers. That was during the 90s, when there was an extensive number of buyouts and absorptions by other companies and that sort of thing. So I ended up working for a number of major manufacturers. And during that experience, I actually had a spiritual awakening while I was in the pharmaceutical industry. And what I started recognizing was the amount of harm that was taking place because of disinformation and misinformation campaigns. Now, that wasn't something that revealed itself to me like overnight. It was a period of time where I started making observations and being led. I believe that I was spiritually being led on a path of discovery, as I still am being led, so that I would be able to communicate to other people via my experience and my knowledge base about what was truly taking place in the pharmaceutical industry and in the healthcare industry overall. So that being said, it wasn't like I decided to get out of the industry, one day I just woke up and said, I'm going to get out. I tried for several years to get out of the industry and started working part-time at one point. And when I say I tried several years to get out of the industry, let me explain that. Because anyone can just quit a job and walk away. Unfortunately, one of the ploys that the pharmaceutical industry uses in order to capture people and to get them to be compliant to their wishes is that they encourage you to get extremely in debt, like right off the get-go. You have to live in a certain neighborhood and a certain quality of home. You have to drive certain qualities of cars. You have to wear designer clothing. You have to have watches that have nice names, sunglasses that have designer names. In other words, they promote a consumer lifestyle to the degree that in order to fit in, you literally are so in debt that it's almost impossible to get out from underneath that at some point, unless you have someone else who can pick up the pieces and, you know, substitute your income. Because they generally hire people who do not have a lot of scientific background, who do not have a lot of medical background. Therefore, it's almost impossible for someone to quit a sales job in the pharmaceutical industry and go out and get a comparable paying position with the company car and the benefits and all of the things that go along with that package. So I tried to get out. I started working part-time for on a contract basis for other manufacturers. And then finally, I was at the point where my own health had deteriorated to such an extent that I had been such a victim of my own philosophy of, you know, the quick fix, pop a pill for everything that ails you, that I literally left the industry with my tail between my legs and barely healthy enough to work for almost a year. And it was at that point that I started doing extensive research and had considered writing a book. And I was going to expose all the blockbuster drugs that had come out, like Vioxx and drugs of that nature, and how they had made it to the market without, you know, the proper clinical testing, etc. And at that point, my niece was attending Indiana University. She was a pre-med student, and she was in a car accident, and she was prescribed hydrocodone, Vicodin, which is a narcotic analgesic. She became addicted, and she increased her usage of the drug over time, which made her have extensive sedative properties from the drug, and she wasn't able to study for exams. So one evening when she was trying to pull an all-nighter for a medical exam that she had the next day, she went to a health food store and purchased some ephedra, which is a stimulant, in order to be able to stay awake. And she took that concomitantly with her hydrocodone, and she had a manic psychotic reaction, which is extremely severe. However, in my research and over a period of time, and now with having talked to thousands of individuals who have had the same problem, I recognize that this is a very common thing for people to react to their drugs, particularly when they're taken in combination with other drugs, because sometimes one drug will potentiate the other drug, and therefore you get a much greater concentration of the drug in your bloodstream. So she had this adverse drug reaction while I was in the process of doing this research for my book. So I started researching her adverse event on antidepressants and on her hydrocodone. Let me back up a minute. After she had this adverse event on the hydrocodone and the combined stimulant, she ended up in a local hospital. And what they did is they tagged her with a bipolar illness diagnosis. And when they did that, they added antidepressants to her drug regimen. So she's having a toxic drug reaction to begin with, which is what is causing the manic psychosis. And they add additional antidepressants and antipsychotic drugs into the mix. And so then she was just on this extremely toxic chemical, combination, and she wasn't able to stabilize. So after a period of time, she ended up dropping out of school. She wasn't able to work. She just floated from one job to another, one, circumstance to another, and she ended up under my care here in Texas. And the final story to my niece was that as we were fighting for her life, literally, and her sanity, trying to keep her from being drugged, we went to court in order to keep her off of the drugs, to get court permission that she wouldn't be drugged involuntarily, and she was granted that. And my sister, who was, obviously following the instructions and the dictates of authoritative figures, she had decided that her daughter needed to be placed back on the drugs. She wasn't recovering quickly enough. She was still extremely paranoid. She was hearing voices, having all kinds of horrendous problems. And so my sister decided that she was going to force her back on drugs, and she called her and told her she was coming home to take her back to the psychiatrist. And my niece tried to hang herself. First, she fashioned a rope from her shoelaces, and she tied it to a ceiling fan. And she tried to hang herself, but her body weight pulled the ceiling fan out of the ceiling structure. So out of desperation, she walked into her younger sister's room, took an oil-filled angel-shaped lantern, poured it over herself, and ignited it. And she burned herself alive.
Wow.
So that gave me nowhere literally to go but out with the information, because I had done an excessive amount of research and I had uncovered an extreme amount of criminality in terms of cover-up and collusion with legislators and other individuals to keep the drugs on the market and to keep the information from being disseminated to the public properly. And quite frankly, not only was I devastated by her loss, but I was livid. I was angry that I had devoted such an extensive amount of my time and energy in my life to a profession that I now found horrendous in its activities from the upper levels. And it was very obvious to me that this was not a conspiracy theory. This was conspiracy in reality, and that it needed to be exposed and it needed to be rectified. So that's the short end of why I came out and started speaking out. Not because I don't consider myself, the most noble person in the world. As a whistleblower is someone who puts themselves at risk. They leave their jobs while they're in their jobs. I wish I had been that noble. I wish I had had the ability to do that while I was still employed in that company, in the companies. But it took a much greater circumstance for me to step forward, and I hope that other people in the industry will heed that and pay attention, because I'm sure they're being spiritually called as well.
Right. Well, the book is very detailed and what you and your family had gone through throughout the entire ordeal. So I want to point that out here, that the book, by the way, to any of our listeners, is definitely worth reading. I also want to point out here that you reference that prescription drug use has become the third largest killer of Americans behind heart disease and cancer. That's a staggering statistic. Even more shocking is that you point out that more than 180,000 people die annually from the negative effects of legal drugs.
That's correct, and that's a conservative figure, Martin, actually, because the FDA, they actually say that only about 5 to 10% of adverse events, and that would include deaths, obviously, related to drug use, are reported through the MedWatch system. So you need to multiply that probably about 10 to 100 times.
Wow. Well, why is this being allowed to happen? I mean, where is the FDA in all this? I mean, this is the agency that's been charged to protect us from all the ill effects of drugs and so forth.
Well, that's what we really actually think that they're designed to do, and maybe that was what they were initially designed to do.
Right.
But the FDA has since become the lapdogs of the pharmaceutical industry, and I saw that personally, that transition from them being the enemy figure that was overseeing and policing the pharmaceutical industry when I was, first came in the 80s, to when in 1992 they passed a piece of legislation called the PDUFA Act, the Prescription Drug Users Fee Act. And what that did is, in essence, it allowed the pharmaceutical industry to fund their regulatory processes. In other words, for every new drug application that the pharmaceutical industry submitted, they were also having to fund, I think it was at the time, $350,000. It's probably more than that at this point in time. I haven't checked that stat in the last couple of years. But $350,000 for a new drug app. And that, in essence, helps push the drug application or the approval application through the system process. And when they started allowing the pharmaceutical industry to in essence, fund that process, what happened was the new drug apps division of the FDA expanded to over 1,000 people, whereas the people who actually monitor the drugs and the adverse events that are currently on the market, and there are over 8,000 of those, by the way, there's only 68 people in that department.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see where the focus is being and where the money is being, directed. It's for the approval and for pushing drugs through the system as quickly as possible. And there are several, consumer advocate groups that have assisted in that process when they tried to get new AIDS drugs released quickly. And I do understand that when there are innovative products that are on the market, that perhaps there's nothing that is even similar to it, that there would be, a necessity or, a cry for that kind of expedience through the system. However, what people have to realize is that the clinical trials for these products are generally very much cherry-picked in terms of their patient populations. And what I mean by that is the drugs aren't tried on everybody. They're not tried on Orientals and blacks and women and children and all of the, various different populations of people that will be consuming the products once they're on the general market. Mm-hmm. They're only tried generally in males, particularly psychiatric drugs, males 18 to 35 years of age. They don't have any disease states. They don't have any concomitant drugs that they're taking. So that really doesn't give you a good assessment of what the drug is going to do when it hits the general population. Mm-hmm. So we really don't know, maybe even 50% of the side effects of a new drug before it's in the general population and for a while, and we start to see the reports come out. Mm-hmm. So that being said, that has really increase the risk factor to the consumer population, because now the FDA is in a kind of a buddy position with the pharmaceutical industry. In other words, the last employer that I had in the industry, they were talking at one point about the cholesterol guidelines and how that we actually needed to get the cholesterol guidelines revised, because now there were studies that were out that showed that when you had LDL below 100 that you had fewer heart attacks and strokes, etc. Mm-hmm. And so therefore they were going to try to compete with this newer product called Lipitor that was on the market that lowered cholesterol more expediently, and we were going to do that by getting the clinical guidelines revised, which would in essence expand the patient population available to these drugs. Hmm. And I raised this question. I said, well, what about the people in the FDA? I mean, what are they going to say about this? And the response from my manager was, oh, well, we have friends in the FDA. We have friends in the FDA who are taking care of this for us. So it actually became a collaborative effort at that point in the early 90s between the pharmaceutical industry and the FDA to get drugs on the market expediently. And then once many of the members of the FDA retire, they seek positions in the pharmaceutical industry as consultants because of their good old boy networks that they have, because of the influence that they have politically. So that pretty much tells you why you cannot depend on the FDA to protect the American populace. We have got to be our own consumer advocates, and we have got to self-educate in order to be protected from these people.
Right. I read a passage in the book, too, that Prozac is the cause of more than 40,000 adverse reactions among patients, and yet it's still being prescribed even to depressed children. I mean, that was shocking to me. And here's an agency. It's okay for them, let's say, to intimidate a health food store for citing, let's say, a university study on the benefits of a supplement or two. But when it comes to something like this, it really, wakes you up as to who this agency really represents, which is the pharmaceutical industry.
Exactly, and you also see that they're definitely biased, because they're obviously not reviewing the studies that the manufacturers of supplements are submitting.
Right.
Because if they were, they would see that some of these products are more efficacious than the drugs that they're approving.
Right. Yeah.
So again, it's a matter, that you have to be aware that these are very strong advocates for, drug use, and they are not going to veer off of that path anytime in the near future. So we have got to be proactive about, seeking our own information and understanding what I was taught as a pharmaceutical rep early on in my career, that all drugs are toxins, period. All drugs are toxins, and everything they do is a side effect. It's just whether or not it's a beneficial effect. And that's what people have to recognize. When you take a drug, you do not solely affect one body system by taking that drug. You are going to affect multiple body systems, and very often they will have also a psychological, emotional, mental effect. You cannot separate the mind-body-spiritual connection. That is what proves the placebo effect. That is why they have to use as a clinical gold standard in every clinical trial for drugs. They have to use an inert placebo drug against it, because that's the big white elephant in the room right now, particularly, Martin, as people are becoming more and more conscious and more spiritually aware. There are 4 drug trials that are reaching what they call the futility boundary, which means that the same amount of people in the placebo group are getting effect as the people that are in the drug group. And that's because if we believe that a product will give us a benefit, if we truly believe that we can heal from something that we take, be it an inert tablet, be it a drug, or be it a supplement, we will experience healing, a certain number of us, because of that mind-body-spiritual connection.
Okay, I want to also cite another passage in your book, Gwen, here. I'm going to quote this, okay? Quote, "We Americans sacrifice our health in order to pursue high-stress jobs and provide for our families. Yet, when we arrive in our retirement years, we are no longer able to enjoy the physical pursuits we experienced in our youth. We must then spend all of our limited resources to maintain or even repair our ailing minds and bodies," unquote. When I read this, it's like, yes, it is so very true. I mean, each day, let's say whether you're at the office or anywhere else, you pretty much have to perform each and every single day, so that, if and when we do reach that retirement age, most of us, for the most part, fully, in this case, are fully dependent on some sort of prescription medication, whether it be for blood pressure, diabetes, arthritis, blood thinners. It's ridiculous,
Yeah, it absolutely is, and it's designed to be that way. The system is designed so that by the time that you get to the end of your life, you will spend the remainder of your resources on the medical fields, and you will be buried basically penniless.
Right.
And that's the way it's designed.
Well, I mentioned this because, when you look at television or other forms of literature such as magazines, we're constantly bombarded with these drug ads, and in tandem with these drug ads, there are commercials out there that challenge our self-esteem. You either don't have the right body, don't live in the perfect neighborhood, don't wear the right clothes, don't drive the perfect car, or have the perfect marriage, or generate the amount of money to live the, quote, American dream. So it's almost like a vicious cycle for us to see these commercials that downplay our self-esteem, where we then become depressed and then seek out the doctor for the right pill that ironically we saw advertised on TV.
Yeah.
It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah, and if you think about it, it's a form of psychological mind control, because that drives you to be a consumer of the products that in essence you really don't need. And it also truncates individualism and our ability to express ourselves. That's another way of making us conform, because like I said, that was the same thing I had to do in the pharmaceutical industry. I had to dress a certain way, I had to drive a certain car, I had to live in a certain neighborhood. I had to play a role of an individual that I wasn't. And that's what I think the whole of society is being tasked to do at this point in time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, what's your perspective to how doctors view their patients, Gwen? Is there like a disconnect there?
I see a very large disconnect there. And the reason that I do is because, and I also, again, having had experience being a hospital representative where I was in the hospital environment where residents were being trained as doctors. And I saw that it is very much the training process, just like it was in the pharmaceutical industry. My husband told me that it was what he had gone through in essence in the military, in his training in the Navy. And so it's very much a brainwashing process, and it's very much a shock and trauma, mind-controlled process, because you are given this impression. You go in and they break you down, and they do that to pharmaceutical reps in the home office when you first come in, and you're lacking sleep, they don't feed you properly, you're given homework where that you have to stay up, and you're on the videotape, on the video camera all day long, you're living in the fishbowl where everybody in the home office can see you. The same thing exists in the hospital environment. They make these doctors, these residents sometimes do not sleep for days on end. They go through extremely shocking procedures. They're forced to operate on animals, and some of them, even though they may be objecting to that because they don't even plan to go into surgery. Maybe they're going to do something completely unrelated, but they have to operate on a live animal, or there's things that they do to these doctors that when they come out, they are desensitized. They literally are desensitized. And when you desensitize an individual to pain and suffering, then that's when you're in a position to be harmed by someone who may have good intentions. And that's what I see happening with doctors. I don't think that their intentions are bad. But there is a saying that the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Right. Well, what about the egos of some doctors? I mean, some patients, they go in to see their physician. The inquisitive ones may want to ask the doctor about the ill effects of this drug, or what could be potential drawbacks in taking this drug. There are some patients who know how to verbalize themselves and be assertive without intimidating the physician. But then again, you mention in your book to challenge authority. What's your advice for anyone going to see their physician and asking the proper questions and so forth?
My advice is that you can arm yourself initially with some good information. Mm-hmm. Now, we do realize that there's lots of blogs and things available on the internet that may not have, the amount of credibility that we would want. Mm-hmm. However, I think that we have to use our own personal spiritual discernment about these things. And if we do not expose ourselves to all of the information, how are we supposed to uncover those things that might be hidden from us, or that might be, colored with rose-colored glasses for our purposes? We won't. So I think it's important for people to do a little of their own due diligence online before seeing their physician, particularly if you already know what your disease state is and you can do some research on that. Look for alternatives. And when you're prescribed a drug, I also advise that people look up the drug before they fill the prescription. And by that, I don't mean just key in the name of the drug in the search engine. What you need to do is you need to key in the name of the drug, and then after that, put in side effects and controversy, because you want to dig up all of the information, that people have put online that may be saying, whoa, 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 this happened to me, pay attention, or doctors that are trying to sound the alarm, or ex-drug reps like myself who are trying to sound the alarm. Pay attention to what they have to say, and then use your own personal discernment. You said it best when you opened the program. We have got to learn to follow that intuition and that internal innate knowingness, which will be expressed in your gut What is your gut feeling? That is where the truth resides. And if you follow your gut, then you will find that the threads will lead you where you need to go for good information.
Yes, and I want to point this out that, especially the elderly, I notice, at least when I, accompany my parents, let's say, go see their doctor, there are some elderly people out there who have no one to go with, to act as someone to speak for them. Let's say to the doctors or to the staff there. How important is this to the elderly? I mean, I know that some physicians are understanding to their patients and they spend some time, with their patients. And there are other physicians, not to judge all physicians, but there are some physicians out there who, in effect, dumb down their patients. You're lucky if you spend more than, maybe half an hour with your physician nowadays.
You're lucky if you spend that much with your physician nowadays. You're finding some rare creatures in the business if you're finding doctors that have 30-minute appointments. Even psychiatrists only giving 15.
Well, the reason why I state that is because I know someone who's on blood thinners, and so her doctor really spends a lot of time asking specific questions. So it's lucky if she'll, be there for maybe 30 minutes. But, for anyone who's on HMOs and so forth, it's like 10 minutes you're out of there.
Oh, yeah.
They don't want to see you.
Right.
Right. And so, someone really has to, and I point this out, to the elderly, because, at their age, they don't want to sound too intimidating, to their physician, and someone maybe younger should accompany, whether it's a grandmother, an aunt, a mom, a dad, to go see, their doctor, because there is that mindset that these physicians have an ego, and I know what I'm talking about. I went to medical school, I paid my dues, so don't challenge what I know.
Right, but we have to realize that all authoritative figures feel that way.
Right.
And we have personal sovereign authority as well, particularly over our health and over our bodies. So when an authority figure approaches you and I'm the authority or I'm the expert, don't buy that. Because
Right.
A lot of the experts are being given false information. A lot of the experts are being they're colluding and they're being coerced into partnering in lies and deception. So you have to be aware that doctors are human beings, and human beings have faults. All of us do. So you cannot say that just because you have an MD behind your name that you're someone that is totally credible, or even if they are credible, like I said, and their intentions are good, they also can fall prey to this misinformation, disinformation campaign that is consistently taking place in the industry to increase the bottom line. That is the motivation of the pharmaceutical industry. For those people who think that these are philanthropists that sit around all day trying to figure out how they can heal the world, then you are delusional and you need to be on one of their drugs.
Right.
Do you get what I'm saying? Because
Right.
they are not. That is not their intent. Their intention is to make money. Their liability and loyalty is to the stockholders. They have a legal obligation to put the stockholders before the consumer. People do not understand that. You're not dealing with individuals. You're dealing with a corporation. Corporations are about money. That's what they're about. And the pharmaceutical industry is in the business of disease management and symptoms maintenance. They want to maintain your disease on drugs, and they want to manage your symptoms with drugs. They are not about health and healing. And I can't express that more adamantly. You need to understand that. Your doctors may have good intentions. Your doctors may be using drugs because they want to heal you, but that's not the reason they're being manufactured, and that's not the reason they're on the market.
So in talking about this this topic that we're just discussing here, how important is it for people to take responsibility of their health? And I ask this because living a frenetic lifestyle, it's so challenging to live a purist lifestyle. I mean, we take shortcuts by not reading the ingredients on, the processed foods that we buy or the fast foods that we line up for. I mean, almost every form of processed food has either too much salt, too much sugar, or loads of corn syrup, which leads to me to mention that you cite that more than, 16 million Americans suffer from diabetes and 24 million are said to have preclinical diabetes. That's mind-blowing.
Yes, and again, those statistics are probably, because the book came out in 2005, those statistics are probably low at this point in time because there has been an explosion of diabetes, particularly in the child population. Our children are presenting now with type 2 diabetes on a regular basis when that was almost unheard of before. Right. So yes, being proactive and being responsible for one's own health is the only way to go. I mean, I know a lot of people who are very eager about universal health care, but I'm going to tell you straight up, if we're counting on the government to be in control of our health care, we're in trouble. Look at everything else the government has controlled. Where is that at? I mean, we have to understand that we have all of the tools that we need in order to be healthy individuals. If we will only do a little bit of due diligence and on our own, we will educate ourselves about what those tools and alternatives are, because no one is going to spend the excessive amount of money that it costs to come on national TV in prime time and tell us, for example, that exercise is twice as effective in reducing depression as antidepressants. There is no drug on the market that's as effective as exercise, but they're not going to spend the money to bring that out and to inform the public about that because number one, most people don't want to have to get off of their butts or off of their regular routines and exercise. They would prefer. It's much easier to take a prescription pill. But they need to understand the ramifications long term of that decision versus maybe, fighting their own desires to be lazy about it and getting out and walking around the block a couple of times at night before they go to bed or just making the informed decision to put better foods in their bodies, like you said, to source their foods properly, maybe buy organic foods, put some money towards that. You can pay the farmer today or you can pay the hospital tomorrow. It's really up to you. But one way or the other, you're going to pay somebody. So you might as well put your money and actually use your money as a political tool, because that is the biggest political tool that you have as a consumer is to not consume things that you know are bad for you. Do not put your money into things that you know are designed to make you unhealthy and to make someone else money in the end. Use your money as your power, because really that's the only thing that corporate America pays attention to, is what you do with your money. Who you vote for, quite frankly, makes no difference whatsoever, because they're all playing on the same team no matter what you think.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I want to just shift the tone of the conversation here that we're talking here in this interview. I want to ask you, Gwen, why is it that once you're branded with a serious psychiatric disorder, and it's almost nearly impossible to receive treatment that doesn't involve a chemical restraint?
That's right. Well, I guess the reason for that is primarily because, number one, it's the ignorance about mental illness and about diseases of the brain. We've been sold down the river about this. We have this biochemical imbalance, and therefore that's the reason why we're anxious, or that's the reason why we're depressed, or, that may be the case in some circumstances, particularly if you are hypoglycemic. The symptoms of hypoglycemia. Look them up in a medical dictionary, people, and you'll see that they mimic many of the things that we refer to as stress, anxiety, depression, and things of that nature. Those are the symptoms of hypoglycemia. And again, if you are sitting around all day drinking sodas and eating refined carbohydrates and processed foods and going to the fast food drive-up window and all of those things, your body may be nutritionally deficient. And that may be one of the reasons that you are exacerbating symptoms such as anxiety or depression. But then there are a whole host of things that may be problematic. You could have a thyroid problem. You could have a contagious, some kind of infectious disease that can exacerbate in psychiatric symptoms. You could have a yeast infection. There's all different types of disease states or problems that can cause these symptoms that are very conveniently diagnosed out of a book called by the way, the 5th edition of it just came out, the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, which all psychiatric illness has to be coded and paid for out of this particular book. And so what it ends up doing is it lists symptoms, and you put a diagnosis according to those symptoms. And once you're diagnosed and you're labeled, it's almost impossible to get out from underneath that label. And once you're labeled and people do not really know what the source of the symptoms are, for example, they haven't given you the thyroid testing, they haven't looked for infectious disease, they haven't done any of the other things that would be done to eliminate other disease states, then they simply use a third party's observation of your behavior to tell you that you have XYZ diagnosis and you're drugged. Why? Because psychiatry is now about the biochemical aspects of drugging. They don't do talk therapy. That's what psychology does. So by virtue of that fact alone, they will not come forward and say that their drugs are defective and that their drugs don't work and that their drugs are harmful, because that would put a whole profession of MDs out of work. Do you get that? Because most of those doctors no longer practice anything but the biochemical intervention for mental illness.
Okay. Well, I want to cite a disturbing passage in your book. One of them is the narrative of Mrs. Ida Smith and how the nursing staff recommended that her doctor put her on Haldol, which, by the way, is a neuroleptic?
Yes, it's one of the older antipsychotic drugs, which was historically reserved for schizophrenia and psychosis and that sorts of thing.
Yeah, and the reason why she was put on this drug was because she was seen as being, quote, combative and quarrelsome, unquote, for complaining on behalf of other patients in a nursing home facility, right? So yeah. I'm wondering how many similar cases like this occur each day and go unreported. You mentioned that, let's see, she pretty much, she showed like signs of withdrawal, lack of initiative. She was pretty much given this drug just to shut her away from the rest of the patients there. And I'm wondering how many of these cases occur each and every day in nursing homes.
Well, I couldn't possibly begin to know how many people have been victim of this particular circumstance, and I relay Ida's story because so many people believe that pharmaceutical reps have no influence on providers. They have no influence on doctors or nurses or their prescribing habits. And I hear that repeatedly from the profession. Oh, well, I see reps, but they don't influence me in any way. And what I bring that story to light for is so that other people recognize that pharmaceutical reps do have a tremendous amount of influence, because the psychology of working with people is that when people bend over backwards to be nice to you and do nice things for you and provide you with goodies and acknowledge your family and your struggles and those sorts of things, which is what pharmaceutical reps are trained to do, then you want to comply and you want to reciprocate and you want to be nice in return and you want to do things for those people in return. And doctors and nurses are no different. So in that regard, I was able to influence people and asked them to do things for me based on our personal relationship and not necessarily on what was best for their patients. When I saw Mrs. Smith, I realized right away she was not the patient type for which I would have recommended Haldol. She was not the patient type at all. But their interpretation of what I had explained to them drew the picture of Mrs. Smith in their minds, and as soon as she acted out again, by golly, they drugged her and they got her off their backs.
Wow.
I believe it happens quite frequently. I just want to go further and say, I can't give you any statistics, but by virtue of the fact that I have a website and 2 Facebook pages and a YouTube channel and all of that, I can tell you that I literally have had hundreds of concerned caretakers as well as the relatives of people in homes about the excessive drugging and about particularly them being drugged with these antipsychotic drugs, which will truncate the life of a normal individual by 25 to 30 years. So you know what it does to people who are already elderly. They die much sooner.
Oh, yeah. And I want to also quote another passage that you cite in your book. You were like invited to an operation. I think it was a heart surgery of an elderly woman who, by the way, it could be anyone's, mom, aunt, relative, or even grandmother. And she had already been sedated. And you mentioned that the nurse's demeanor had changed from reassuring the patient that everything would be okay. And by the way, she was, 84, as I understood, 84 years old. And the demeanor had changed from, reassuring the patient that everything would be okay to that of disrespect. Because they pretty much saw her, she had a mastectomy and other physical traits. And when I read this passage, it was very disturbing because, it's like, these people, you entrust your confidence in them. We pretty much bestow our trust to. Isn't there like a code of ethics out there for this type of behavior? In effect, the way I interpreted this is that they were ridiculing her when she was sedated.
Yes, in fact, I was quite disquieted. I was disgusted with the behavior that I observed on that day. And quite frankly, I was privileged to have been given this experience because not very many pharmaceutical reps are allowed this type of experience. But the surgeon was such a, I don't even know a nice way to put it.
Yeah.
Let me find a nice word. He was such a flirt, okay, and a womanizer that he had seen me in the cath lab the previous day with one of his colleagues, and I was observing a procedure, and he said, oh, well, if you really want to see a real doctor at work, meet me in the OR in the morning and you can watch an open heart surgery, which I have to admit was absolutely the most educational experience, and I was just absolutely mesmerized the whole 5 hours. But it was also an opportunity for me to see the lack of respect, the lack of compassion that really existed amongst the workers. I don't know, if that was an isolated incident, but I've never really had anyone challenge me on it yet in the medical profession, so I'm beginning to think that it isn't, because someone would have said, oh, well, we've never seen anybody behave this way, or we've never done this, or whatever, like, I've gotten from various other things that I've said in my book. I've never had anyone challenge me on that, and I was very disheartened because I knew that, just like you said, we entrust our lives to these people, and we expect a certain amount of respect and at least consideration for us as individuals and human beings. And here they were mocking this woman and making fun of her physical traits and joking about her, and it made me extremely uncomfortable to be in their presence while doing so.
Okay, well, so Gwen, what advice can you offer to anyone whose family member has been diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder? Are there any holistic avenues available out there?
Well, first of all, I would recommend that everyone visit the organization Citizens Commission on Human Rights website, cchr.org. It is an organization that has compiled an extensive amount of, it's a human rights organization, and they have compiled an extensive amount of information about all of these drugs, and it is good information. I have gone through the website myself. I would not send anyone there if I hadn't looked at the information, and that's the reason I'm sending people there, for the compilation of information, not for the organization itself. People can choose to be a part of that organization or not be a part of that organization, but the information that they have provided on that website is invaluable. And also, I would recommend that people do, again, as I said, their due diligence about the individual doctors. Try to find a doctor, if you haven't already gotten a doctor, that has an integrative care MD behind his name, someone who is knowledgeable about alternatives, someone who knows about nutrition, someone who knows about, other therapies such as chiropractic and acupuncture and things of that nature, because depending on the diagnosis, very frequently some short-term intervention from one of those other disciplines will be all that is necessary. I would exhaust every other avenue prior to taking a psychiatric drug. And the reason for this is I have done my homework. I have dedicated my life to this. This is my spiritual calling. All I do every day for 8 to 10 hours every day is research and read and get information so that I can give good information to other people. And I know that people don't have the luxury of doing that. Our society isn't set up so that we can, but you do have resources and places that you can go, like my website, like CCHR, where people have taken this initiative and done it. And that's where you need to go for information. And quite frankly, I have nothing against psychiatry as a profession, but I do have a complete different opinion of their tools. And so I would say, as a last resort, hit the psychiatrist's office as a last resort, just because they don't have anything in their armamentarium but drugs.
Interesting. Okay, Gwen, we are approaching the end of the first hour. Would you care to remind our listeners on how they can reach you, our audience can reach you, and where they can purchase your book?
Yeah. I'd be happy to. My website is GwenOlsen.com. That's GwenOlsen, GwenOlsen.com. Again, I have a YouTube channel. I have 2 Facebook pages. If people will like me on Facebook, I share a lot of information, especially anything that breaks and new items that come out, things that I discover in research, etc. And my book is Confessions of an RX Drug Pusher. You can find it on Amazon.com. It isn't in bookstores. It's in all of the online book carriers. But I would ask for your audience, for those of you who would like to help support my work, this is all that I do. I do not have a job. I do not do anything but an occasional speaking engagement. And I write and try to disseminate information. If you buy the book from my website, I'll be happy to autograph it. And I do make a little bit more money that way off of the book if you buy it from my website at GwenOlsen.com. And I would appreciate your support in that way.
Now, you mentioned that you do, 1 or 2 lectures or speaking engagements?
Yes, I was doing quite a number. I was doing at least 2 a month for several years, and then I got, with the travel restrictions and everything.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's just gotten to the point that now I usually only do 2 or 3 very large venues a year, and the occasional one in my local vicinity when people want me to come speak, because I don't have to travel so much.
Right. Now, it's my understanding you also have planned another book, which, from what I gather, addresses the beneficial effects of herbs and other natural therapies for mental wellness. Is that correct?
That actually, I was going to write a book about that, and I did announce that in my first book.
Mm-hmm.
What happened was I was able to co-author and do another book with a group of doctors that's called the Maximized Living Manual. And the Maximized Living Manual actually has covered all of those things, and it really addresses all of the nutritional aspects, exercise. It really does cover the whole gamut of how one remains healthy in mind, body, and spirit.
Okay. Do you have any closing comments you'd like to make, Gwen, for our listeners out there? What can you state? Any advice? Any comments you'd like to make to any of our listeners out there about taking control of their health, of their life?
Well, I think that the statements that you made initially, Martin, when you opened the show were spot on, and I couldn't agree more with you in that people have to look at what they're doing in terms of taking responsibility for their own health. It's so easy to blame, the military-industrial complex on all the ills of our lives and all of that. But the truth is, you have a choice when you go to the grocery store. You have a choice, first of all, where you shop, and you can go to local farmers markets or local health food stores. There are other places that you can shop besides your big, corporate-owned grocery store. And you can make sure that instead of, being a couch potato every evening, that you take the initiative to go out and walk around and be outside and connect with nature. And a lot of adults don't even do that anymore, and neither do our children. And quite frankly, I don't see how any of us stay healthy when we don't have our connection to God and earth. Right. So I really believe that that's important too, is to just go out, commune with nature, get close to your spirit once in a while, and you'll start to get instructions and you'll start to be healthier because you will normally gravitate towards healthier choices. When you sit comatose on the couch in front of the television several hours a day, what the television does is it emits a low frequency wave, which puts you in an alpha state of hypnosis. And if you've ever watched a child who has sat for several hours watching television, sometimes their mouths are hanging open as they're sitting there leaning into the television because they're so literally hypnotized. And that's what they're doing to the general population. We need to turn off our televisions, stop getting our information from the boob tube, and recognize that we need to read and we need to research and we need to experience life, and we need to stop desiring to be like everyone else. We weren't made like cookie cutter people. God made us different colors. He made us with different attributes, physical and spiritually, and we need to express those and be individuals, because I think a lot of what is depressing the human race particularly is we're trying to be pigeonholed. We've forgotten our noble purpose of why we are here, which is to experience and express God's love and God's joy amongst ourselves. And if we're not doing that, we are missing the boat. We have missed our purpose. And so people need to go back to the things that make them happy, that feed them spiritually and bring them joy into their lives. And they will see, as a consequence, their health will improve.
Awesome. Well said. Well, I appreciate you taking the time here to chat with me, Gwen, for the first hour. And I look forward to the second hour, okay?
Yes, and I just might add to that,
sure,
your show's name is perfect for what I just ended with, because as above, so below.
Right.
As within, so without. And with that, I would like to ask your audience and your listeners to please be proactive. Be proactive for our children, because they are our future.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again, Gwen. As I said, I'll call you for the second part of our interview here. And again, for any of our listeners, the book, once again, is, you want to mention that once again real quick, Gwen?
Yes, Confessions of an RX Drug Pusher. And I also would like to plug a book that I contributed to that came out in February. It's called Drugging Our Children: How Profiteers Are Pushing Antipsychotics on Our Youngest and What We Can Do to Stop It. And that is by Prager Publications. You cannot get that on my website, but that is available online and in all bookstores.
Oh, you want to just give the URL for the website? Is it gwenolsen.com?
Yes, Gwen Olsen, GwenOlsen.com.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks again, Gwen, for your time here, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Martin, and make it a great day.
You too, Gwen. Take care. Goodbye.
Bye.
That's it for the first hour on As Above, So Below Radio. Tune in for the second hour by subscribing to HolisticAdvocate.com, where Gwen will further share her insights on her personal experiences as a pharmaceutical sales rep and how competitive and grueling this profession was for her. Orthomolecular psychiatry. Is this the new wave we can expect in the field of psychiatry? The impact on children being forced to take Ritalin and Adderall in order to function better in school for the benefit of the teaching institution, and how middle-aged Americans are committing suicide at a phenomenal rate, and so much more. You're listening to As Above, So Below Radio.